Alongside the coercive acts that Parliament enacted in response to the Boston Tea Party, it also enacted the Quebec Act. It was not itself a response to the Boston Tea Party, but colonists saw it as part and parcel of the coercive or intolerable acts. The Quebec Act was, in essence, the first written constitution for a British colony. Crafted by Parliament, it outlined the structure of the colony's government, restored French civil law in Quebec, protected the legal privileges of the Catholic Church, afforded Catholics religious freedom, and opened political offices to them. Also, it extended Quebec's boundaries to include the Ohio Valley, thus frustrating the Western territorial aspirations of both Virginia and Pennsylvania, two of the most populous and influential colonies in British America. So historians often present Americans' outrage over the Quebec Act as reflecting xenophobic and anti-Catholic resentment over the various gifts that the act bestowed on their former enemies in Canada. Moreover, historians present colonists' belief that the Quebec Act, like the Intolerable Acts, was aimed at them. They see it as reflecting a myopic and paranoid misunderstanding of Parliament's complex imperial considerations. But when one examines what colonial authorities themselves had to say about the Quebec Act, their opposition to it emerges as informed, coherent, and sensible, and in hindsight, also prescient. Certainly, Americans were generally wary of the French and of Catholicism, but the complaint that circulated in America about the Quebec Act did not focus primarily on the French settlers there, but on Parliament and the imperial constitution. The critical component of the Quebec Act that caught the attention and ire of American critics was that Quebec was going to be governed without a legislature, by a governor and an unelected council. Those who were already concerned and agitated by the imperial reforms of the previous decade, reforms aimed at curtailing self-government in British colonies, those people saw Quebec, as constituted by Parliament in the Quebec Act, as Britain's model colony. American critics understood the Quebec Constitution as a blueprint for what Parliament was hoping to accomplish in colonial administration more generally. And this American assessment gains credibility when one examines the governing philosophy and structure of the Second British Empire. Okay, so when you look at how Britain organized its empire after the defeat in the American Revolution, you can see that it's true that the Quebec Constitution, the Quebec Act, really was a kind of model for how Britain would structure the empire later on. So, so the Quebec Act gave credence to the Sons of Liberty's accusations that Parliament had long conspired to emasculate and sideline American assemblies and courts of law, to extend Parliament's jurisdiction over the colonies, and to strengthen direct royal governance within the colonies. At a time when the ideological trend on both sides of the British Atlantic was toward greater transparency and accountability in government, Parliament had initiated multiple reforms that made colonial governments and courts of law more opaque and unaccountable to colonial constituents, and more transparent and accountable to Parliament. The Quebec Act was received with great alarm and a grave sense of urgency because of its timing in conjunction with the coercive acts in Massachusetts. It seemed that after a decade of tinkering with half measures that curtailed local governance and oversight over imperial officials, Parliament was finally acting on its decade-long conspiracy to fundamentally transform America by legislation in Quebec and by brutal force in Massachusetts. So the events in Massachusetts and Quebec seemed to indicate that Parliament had tired of debating the colonists over jurisdiction, law, and the imperial constitution. It was instead pressing ahead and forcing its will on them. It was that fear and that urgency that led sober men of property and standing into a rebellion that was extremely dangerous to their and their families' wealth, position, and lives. Thank you.